I had been on the road for nearly 4 hours when I turned onto the quiet street where my son lived. It was late afternoon in Seattle, the kind of gray winter light that made everything look slightly washed out. I had driven up from Salem with a pot of homemade chicken soup strapped into the passenger seat, wrapped in 2 towels so it would stay warm. It was the same soup I used to make for Ethan when he was little and ran a fever. I told myself he might remember that and smile a little. I also brought a small stuffed bear for Noah, something soft and simple. I wanted this visit to feel gentle, not overwhelming. I just wanted to see my grandson. When I parked in front of their townhouse, I sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel. My heart was beating faster than it should. I could not tell if it was excitement, nerves, or something in between. It had been weeks since I had last seen them, and that visit had lasted barely a couple of hours. I had replayed it 100 different ways in my mind, wondering if I had said something wrong, done something wrong. I told myself not to overthink. Just breathe. You are a mother visiting your child. Nothing more complicated than that. I walked up the path to the door and knocked lightly. A few seconds passed. I heard footsteps inside, and then the handle turned. The door opened only part way. Lily stood there. She looked tired. Her hair pulled back loosely, dark circles under her eyes. She tried to smile, but it did not reach her eyes. She kept one hand on the door as if she did not plan on opening it any farther. I said hello and held up the container of soup with a small, hopeful lift. I made something warm for you all. I thought it might help on a cold day. Lily nodded, but her face barely changed. Today isn't a good day. I need peace. Her voice was calm, not hostile, but firm in a way that made my stomach tighten. Before I could answer, Ethan stepped into view behind her. He did not come forward. He placed a gentle hand on Lily's arm, almost protective. He gave me a small nod. Mom. Hey. His voice was soft but uneasy. I waited for him to push the door open or at least step out on the porch with me. He did not. He looked over his shoulder toward something inside, then back at me, but not quite meeting my eyes. Lily's having a rough day. Maybe this isn't the best time. I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the soup, a slow ache spreading from the center outward. I kept my voice even. I understand. I thought I could drop this off. I haven't seen you in a while, and I hoped maybe. He shifted his weight and looked at the floor. Mom, please. Just not today. It will make things harder for her. There it was, the same sentence he had used before. Maybe he did not even realize he was doing it. Maybe he did. Hard to tell. I could hear a faint sound inside the house, maybe the baby fussing or a television playing low. I tried to look past them, just for a glimpse of Noah, but Lily leaned her shoulder slightly into the gap, blocking my view. Not rude, just deliberate. I swallowed and steadied my voice. Is Noah all right? He's fine, Mom. Just napping, Ethan said. The words too quick, as if rehearsed. We're trying to keep the house calm. I nodded again, even though nothing about this felt calm. I placed the soup on the porch near my feet because I did not know if she would take it from my hands. I also set the little bear beside it. You can have these when you feel up to it. No rush. Lily said thank you in a polite, neutral tone that made me feel like a delivery driver instead of family. She glanced at Ethan, a small, silent conversation passing between them. He gave her a reassuring squeeze on the arm. I noticed it. I wondered if she noticed that I noticed. Ethan finally raised his eyes to mine. There was something like guilt there, faint but real. Before he pushed it away, we'll call you soon, I promise. I did not trust myself to speak without my voice shaking, so I simply nodded. I stepped back one pace, Lily closed the door slowly, gently, almost respectfully, but it still felt like a barrier sliding into place. Not slammed, just firmly shut. I stood there for a moment, looking at the white paint of the door, listening to the muffled sounds inside. Then I turned and walked down the front steps. The cold air stung more than it should have. I reached my car and unlocked it, placing my empty hands on the steering wheel again. The warmth of the soup was gone now, and so was the small hope I brought with me. I sat there for a long breath before starting the engine. Something inside me felt suspended, like I had stepped into a moment that would not fully reveal its meaning until later. I did not cry, not yet. I simply put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb while the light outside dimmed into early evening. I drove slowly through the neighborhood, letting the streetlights flicker across the windshield as I tried to quiet the stirring in my chest. By the time I reached the main road, the sky had slipped fully into evening. I kept both hands on the wheel, not because I needed to, but because I needed something steady to hold on to. It struck me how different things were from the years when Ethan was young, when every problem felt temporary, when love felt simple. It had been just the two of us for so long that I never imagined a day when a closed door would feel like a wall between us. The highway opened up ahead of me, and I settled into a calm lane, letting the familiar rhythm of driving ease some of the ache. My thoughts drifted back, not in a dramatic rush, just a gentle pull. I could see Ethan at 7 years old, sitting at our little kitchen table in Salem, swinging his legs and asking if we could make pancakes for dinner. I could see him at 11, running across the yard with a school project he made, proud as could be. I remembered the smell of his shampoo, the sound he made when he slept, the way he hugged me with complete trust. Those were the years when we still believed everything would be all right. I had lost my husband far too early. One morning he was kissing me on the forehead before leaving for work, and that afternoon I was sitting in a hospital waiting room, barely able to breathe. Ethan was a teenager then, still a boy in so many ways, and I had to figure out how to be mother and father at the same time. I remember sitting on our front porch late at night after he went to bed, staring at the quiet street and wondering how in the world I was going to get us through the next month. But somehow I always did. Back then, there was no distance between us. We were a team. He used to tell me, his tiny hand in mine. I still remember the first time he brought home an A in math and hugged me like he had just won a trophy. That boy adored me, and I adored him. I suppose that is what makes all of this so painful. You can prepare for the loss of a job or a change in routine. Nothing prepares you for the moment your child treats you like a stranger. I pulled into a rest stop just south of Tacoma and parked near the edge where a row of pine trees lined the lot. I turned off the engine and sat there, listening to the quiet ticking as the car cooled. A man in a heavy jacket walked past with a cup of coffee. A family piled out of a minivan, the kids laughing as they stretched their legs. All of them looked like scenes from a normal life. I felt quietly disconnected from it all, like I was watching from behind a pane of glass. I reached into my purse and touched the photo I kept in a side pocket. It was a little faded now, but still clear enough. Ethan, on his first day of third grade, wearing a bright red backpack and grinning with a gap between his teeth. He had hugged me so tightly that morning before running up the steps of the school. I thought he would always need me like that. I never pictured a future where I stood on his porch holding soup he did not want, talking to him through a door that would not open. I stayed there only a short while, then started the car again and drove the rest of the way home. By the time I turned onto my street in Salem, the houses were quiet and dark. I carried my purse inside and set my keys on the kitchen counter. The silence greeted me, familiar but a little sharper than usual. I put on the kettle, not because I needed tea, but because I needed something warm to hold. While I waited for the water to heat, I leaned on the counter and let the weight of the day press fully into me. It was strange how a single moment could make you feel the passing of years. The distance between who Ethan had been and who he was now felt vast, like two different lives connected by a thin thread that I was afraid might snap if I pulled too hard. I took my tea to the living room and sat down in my old armchair. The cushion sagged a little where I had sat for years reading books or watching the evening news. I pulled the blanket over my lap. The room felt colder than usual, though the thermostat said otherwise. I glanced toward the framed pictures on the wall, the ones I had hung back when Ethan left for college, him at the beach when he was 5, him holding the family dog, him at his high school graduation with an expression that looked so open to the world it almost hurt to look at now. I closed my eyes and replayed the scene on the porch earlier. Lily's tired but guarded face, the polite wall between us, Ethan's hand on her arm, the way he would not step outside. It was not anger that rose in me, but something quieter, a kind of grief that settled deep, a grief for the little boy he once was, and for the mother I had once been to him. I reminded myself that lives change. People build families. New loyalties form. But even with all of that, I believed I had earned a place in his life. Not a grand one, just a steady corner. Yet standing on that porch, I felt like I was being gently ushered out of the frame altogether. I turned on a small lamp and tried to read a few pages of a book, but the words drifted past me without landing. I set it aside and simply folded my hands in my lap. It was then that I admitted something I had been avoiding for a long time. The distance had not begun today. It had begun years earlier, when Ethan moved to Seattle and gradually called less, visited less, became harder to reach. I had told myself he was busy. I had told myself it was normal. Children grow up. Mothers step back. But this was something different. This felt intentional. I took a slow breath and let it out. I was not ready to figure out the why of it. Not yet. I only knew that today had drawn a line I could no longer pretend not to see. Outside, a car passed, its headlights sliding across my living room wall. The house settled with a soft creak as the night grew colder. I sat there looking at the empty space around me, the quiet that stretched through the rooms like a soft, steady tide. I stayed there for a while longer, holding my cooling cup of tea, thinking of the long years behind me and the uncertain ones ahead. It was a strange feeling, to love so deeply and yet stand so far outside the circle. I did not know then how much farther that distance would stretch or how much it would take for it to finally shift. But that evening, alone in my quiet house, I felt the first flicker of something that would not fully take shape until much later. Something that would change more than I expected. I just did not know it yet. The next morning I woke with a heaviness that followed me from room to room as I moved through my little house. I made coffee, stood by the kitchen window, watched the damp Oregon sky, and let my mind drift to the one memory I had tried to avoid for months. The day I first met Lily's parents, the day I understood, in a quiet, unmistakable way, that the world my son had entered was not one that had space for me. It had been almost 3 years earlier. Ethan had called and told me that Lily wanted me to come up to Bellevue for a small family dinner. I remember feeling hopeful. Maybe she wanted to get closer. Maybe this was the start of something steady and warm. I baked my apple cobbler, the one recipe people always ask me for, and carried it inside a tin wrapped in a kitchen towel. Their house sat at the end of a long street lined with manicured lawns. It was tall and bright with wide windows and a front porch decorated for spring, even though spring had barely begun. I remember standing there on the walkway, holding the cobbler, and suddenly wishing I had worn something nicer. My blouse felt too plain, my shoes too worn. But I told myself to stop overthinking. I rang the bell and waited. Lily opened the door and greeted me politely. She kissed my cheek, thanked me for coming, then stepped aside to let me in. The entryway had a faint lavender scent and a shine on the floors that made me nervous to walk on them. I could hear soft music playing in the background and voices drifting from the dining room. Helen was the first person I saw. She turned when she heard my footsteps and walked toward me with a practiced smile. She was dressed in a deep blue sweater and pearl earrings that caught the light every time she moved her head. She took the cobbler from my hands and thanked me, then placed it on the counter without looking at it again. "Tell me about your work, Maggie." She had asked that before I had even taken off my coat. Still at the clinic, I nodded and explained that I was cutting back my hours and thinking about easing into full retirement. Retirement. She repeated the word as if turning it over. And health care. "Do you still have decent coverage now that you are no longer full-time?" It was asked lightly, but the tone under it was unmistakable. A question meant to place me somewhere on a chart she kept in her mind. James greeted me next. He was polite, kind in the way busy people are kind, smiling while glancing toward the hallway as if checking on something else. He asked about my drive, complimented the cobbler, but never lingered in conversation. He seemed like a man with a long mental list and no time to slow down. I looked for Ethan. He walked into the room a few minutes later and smiled at me with genuine warmth. He hugged me and asked how the drive had been. The moment felt so familiar that for a second, everything tightened in my chest. A memory of how things used to be before life stretched us apart. Dinner was served soon after. The table was perfect in a magazine way, with tiny candles and plates that matched in a pattern I had never seen before. The food was lovely. Chicken roasted with herbs, a salad with cranberries and roasted nuts, soft rolls that smelled like butter. I thanked Lily for preparing such a nice meal. She said her mother had done most of it. Most of dinner passed politely. I tried to join in the conversation, but I often felt a step behind, as if everyone else knew the rhythm and I was still learning the beat. Helen asked Lily about her work at the design firm and asked Ethan how things were going at Cascade Urban Design Group. Each answer from them led to a question from her, as if she was checking on the progress of two projects she was managing. When she turned to me, her tone shifted subtly. "How are things in Salem these days? Still quiet there, I imagine." I smiled and said quiet could be nice. She lifted her water glass and took a sip without looking at me. After dinner, I carried my plates into the kitchen. Lily followed with a few dishes. Helen stayed behind in the dining room with James. I was washing my hands at the sink when I heard Helen's voice drifting through the open doorway. She was speaking quietly, but not quietly enough. "You need boundaries, sweetheart. Men who are too close to their mothers can be difficult in a marriage." There was a pause, the kind that makes your heart stop even before you hear the reply. Then Lily answered in a low voice, "I know, Mom. I am working on it. Working on it." The words slid into me like a dull blade. I dried my hands slowly. I did not want to step back into that dining room too quickly and make them uneasy. I needed a moment to swallow the tight feeling rising in my throat. When I returned, Lily gave me a small smile. Helen smiled too, but her eyes held something sharper, an appraisal of sorts. I tucked my hands together so she would not see them tremble. After dessert, which no one ate much of except Ethan, I hugged him goodbye and thanked Lily for the evening. Helen thanked me for coming and told me safe travels. James shook my hand. Everything looked perfectly polite from the outside. Only on the drive home did the truth settle fully. I had not been welcomed. I had been measured. I took another sip of my morning coffee as the memory faded. Outside, the sky had begun to clear, a faint brightness stretching across the clouds. I set my mug in the sink and pressed my fingers to the edge of the counter, steadying myself. I wish there had been some clear sign that day telling me what was coming, a warning, a moment that said things will change and you need to brace yourself. But life never works that way. It gives you quiet clues, scattered pieces, a tone in a voice, a look between two people, a sentence you were not meant to hear. I walked to the living room and opened a window to let in some of the cool morning air. The curtains moved gently as I stood there listening to distant traffic. It struck me that the beginning is rarely where you think it is. Sometimes the beginning of a heartbreak sits quietly in a memory from years before, waiting for the day you finally understand what it meant. I closed the window, sat on the edge of the couch, and let out a long, steady breath. What I did not know then was how far those small, quiet warnings would carry, or how much they would shape the days that were still ahead. I kept thinking about that dinner in Bellevue as the months unfolded, the memory surfacing at odd moments like a song you cannot quite shake. It was always there, somewhere in the back of my mind, while Ethan and Lily's life moved forward in Seattle and mine stayed quiet in Salem. I had hoped time would soften things, that once Lily settled into her job and their routines, we might find a path towards something warmer. I wanted to believe there was still room for me, even if it was small. I held on to that hope longer than I should have. When Lily told Ethan she was pregnant in early 2023, he called me with an excitement in his voice I had not heard in a long while. I was standing in my backyard in my gardening gloves, pulling out weeds near the fence. When my phone rang, I wiped my hands on my jeans and answered. His voice came through bright and breathless. Mom, we're having a baby. I felt a rush of joy so strong it almost took my breath away. For a moment it felt like all the hard edges between us had disappeared. I congratulated him, asked how far along Lily was, asked if she was feeling well. He answered quickly, said she was tired but healthy, said they were both nervous and excited. I asked if I could speak to her for a moment, just to tell her I was happy for her. He hesitated, then said she was resting. I told him to give her my love. When he hung up, I stood there in my yard with my hands still half covered in dirt and felt more hopeful than I had in months. The weeks that followed were filled with small efforts on my part to stay connected. I knitted a soft yellow blanket and mailed it to them. I found tiny socks at a local boutique and added them to the package. A few days later, I asked Ethan if they had arrived. He said yes, thanked me, said Lily appreciated it, but she never texted me herself. I tried not to read too much into it. As Lily's pregnancy progressed, I checked in now and then. Sometimes she would reply with a short text. Sometimes she did not reply at all. Ethan would explain that she was overwhelmed with work or simply tired. I believed him at first. Pregnancy could be exhausting. I remembered how hard my own had been. One afternoon, I decided to call. When Ethan picked up, I heard a rustling sound in the background. It was Lily, her voice low and frustrated, telling someone to move something from the nursery. I asked if they had started setting up the baby's room. He said yes. I asked if I could see it over video. He hesitated again. The camera shifted, and I caught only a quick glimpse of pale blue walls before Lily's hand came into view and covered the lens. The call ended shortly after. He said Lily did not feel comfortable showing it yet. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, just stress. But something in the tone of her voice that day stayed with me. There was a sharpness, like a warning. The months passed faster than I expected. I waited for news, waited for updates, waited for some sign that they wanted me to be part of this milestone. When the due date approached, I kept my phone close every day. Even took it into the shower on the bathroom counter in case I missed a call. The call never came. Instead, I found out the way strangers did. I was sitting on my sofa one morning sipping coffee when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from social media. I tapped it without thinking. There it was, a photo of a newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket, tiny and pink with wisps of dark hair on his head. The caption said, "Welcome Noah James Thompson." The three of them were in the picture. Lily looked tired but radiant. Ethan looked proud. He was holding the baby close to his chest. Helen was tagged in the photo. I was not. For a moment, everything in me went quiet. The world around me fell away, and all I could see was my grandson's face on a screen. I tried to slow my breathing, but it came out uneven, shaky. My hands trembled so badly that I had to put the phone down on the coffee table. I do not know how long I sat there before I reached for the phone again and called Ethan. When he answered, his voice sounded exhausted but light, as if he was floating somewhere above the weight of everything. "Mom, hey, we're all good. Noah's here." His voice was soft, but not intimate, not the voice you reserve for the person who waited for the call. I swallowed back the ache and asked why he had not called. He said everything happened fast. Lily went into labor early. They rushed to the hospital. Things were hectic. I listened and nodded, even though he could not see me. I asked how Lily was. He said tired but healthy. I asked if I could come visit, just for a moment, just to see the baby. He paused. I could hear muffled voices in the background. Then he said Lily needed rest. It was not a good time for visitors. I asked again, more quietly this time, if I could come in a few days. He hesitated, then said he would have to check with Lily. He never called back. I told myself to be patient. Just give them a little time. New parents get overwhelmed. Maybe things would settle after the first week. Maybe Lily's anxiety would ease. Maybe someone would realize that a grandmother deserved a place in those first few days. But days passed with no word. Then one evening, while I was washing dishes, my phone buzzed again. It was another photo of Noah. This time, he was in Lily's arms. Helen stood beside her, smiling wide, her hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder. The caption read, "Blessed to welcome our sweet boy. Thank you, Mom, for being here through it all." I stared at that photo until the water in the sink went cold. I did not know if I was angrier at them for shutting me out or at myself for believing I would not be. I set the sponge down and leaned on the counter, letting the weight in my chest settle because there was nothing else to do. A few days later, after more silence than I could bear, I texted Ethan again, just a simple message asking when I could come meet my grandson. It took him hours to respond. Finally, he wrote that they were still adjusting and Lily needed more time. I wrote back saying I understood. I told him to let me know when things felt calmer. He did not reply. The next morning, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a small stuffed bear I had bought weeks earlier, the one Noah had never touched. I pressed my fingers into its soft fur, and wondered how something so tiny could feel like such a heavy reminder of where I stood. I knew something was wrong, not with the baby, not with the adjustment, something deeper, something that had been quietly building from the very moment I stepped into that house in Bellevue years before. I just did not know how deep it would go or how much it would take from me before the truth finally revealed itself. I woke the next morning with a heaviness in my chest that felt like it had settled there overnight, as if it had chosen a permanent place inside me. I moved through my kitchen in a kind of fog, making coffee I barely tasted, staring at the quiet house that suddenly felt too big and too empty. I kept thinking that maybe I was wrong. Maybe I had misread the situation. Maybe they were simply overwhelmed. But deep down, I knew better. Silence can be loud when it comes from someone you love. Around mid-morning, I decided I could not sit in the house any longer. I grabbed my keys and drove to the grocery store, not because I needed anything, but because I needed to feel movement around me. I wandered the aisles slowly, picking up items I did not really need. A jar of homemade jam, a box of tea, a bag of flour I would likely never use. I stopped in the baby aisle, staring at the shelves of diapers and tiny bottles of lotion. I picked up a small bottle of lavender baby wash, held it in my hand, then put it back. It felt too painful to imagine gifting something they would probably ignore. On my way out of the store, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. He wrote that they were exhausted, that Noah had kept them up all night, that they needed more time before visitors. There was no mention of when I might see them, no warmth, no invitation. I typed a reply, telling him I understood, then deleted it. Instead, I wrote, "Take your time, sweetheart. Let me know if you need anything." He responded with a short thanks. I stood in the parking lot staring at the screen until the brightness hurt my eyes. The next few days unfolded in that same dull rhythm. I kept calling and texting, but always with caution, always trying not to sound like I was pushing. Sometimes Ethan picked up. Sometimes he let it go to voicemail. When he did answer, his voice sounded even more distant than before, as if every word he said was being rationed. I asked if he was getting enough sleep. He said they were managing. I asked how Lily was feeling. He said she was sensitive and overwhelmed. I asked about Noah, and his tone would soften just a little, but then he would rush off the phone again. After almost 2 weeks of these brief conversations, I decided to try something different. I made a batch of chicken soup, the same recipe my own mother used to make when someone in the family was sick or drained. It was warm and comforting, a small gesture of love that had always meant safety in our home. I ladled it into a container, wrapped some cornbread in foil, and packed it all carefully into a paper bag. I added a little note inside telling them I loved them and that I hoped they were getting some rest. The drive to Seattle felt longer than usual. Traffic was heavy, the rain steady against the windshield, and every mile I felt my stomach tighten a little more. By the time I reached their neighborhood, the clouds had turned a deeper shade of gray that made everything feel heavier. I parked across the street and sat for a minute with the bag of food on my lap, rehearsing what I would say if Lily answered the door instead of Ethan. I told myself to stay calm, to be gentle, to remind her I only wanted to help. When I finally walked up the driveway, the house looked quiet, curtains drawn, lights dim, no sound from inside. I rang the bell and took a small step back. I could hear movement inside, soft footsteps, a voice I could not make out. Then the door opened just a few inches, and Lily stood there holding Noah against her chest. She looked tired, more tired than I expected. with dark circles under her eyes and hair pulled back in a loose bun. But her face did not soften when she saw me. If anything, she seemed startled, irritated. I smiled and lifted the bag. I brought some soup and cornbread. I thought you might need a warm meal. She looked at the bag without reaching for it. Her voice was quiet but sharp. I need peace right now. Elaine. My eyes met hers, and I felt something inside me tighten. I understand, I said softly. I just brought this in case you needed it. She shook her head like she wanted to stop the conversation before it went any further. Not today. Maybe another time. I stood there for a moment, trying to think of what to say, trying to think of something that would reach her. Before I could speak again, Ethan came down the hallway and appeared behind her. He looked surprised to see me, but not happy. Mom, you should have called first. His voice had a strange mix of embarrassment and annoyance. I felt a rush of warmth rise to my face. I did not know what to say, except I thought you could use a meal. I will go. He nodded quickly, as if that was the easiest solution. Lily turned the door slightly more closed, her arm tightening protectively around the baby. Noah let out a small sound, a soft gurgle, and I felt a tear press behind my eyes. I stepped back. They did not step forward. The door closed between us without another word. I walked down the driveway with the bag still in my hand. The air smelled like wet pavement and cedar. The entire moment felt unreal, like I had slipped into someone else's life. I opened the back door of my car and set the bag on the seat. Then I sat behind the wheel and stared at the windshield as raindrops gathered and slid downward, blurring everything beyond the glass. I did not cry then. Not yet. I drove halfway home before the weight inside me became too heavy. I pulled off the highway and parked at a rest stop, cutting the engine. The silence inside the car felt like a physical thing pressing against my ribs. I pressed my forehead to the steering wheel and finally let the tears come. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, steady stream that I had been trying to hold back for days. When I got home, I carried the bag inside, set it on the counter, and went straight to my bedroom. I lay down on the bed fully clothed, closed my eyes, and let the exhaustion sink into me. For the first time, I wondered if maybe they really did not want me in their lives at all. I wondered how something so fundamental could break so completely. I wondered how I was supposed to keep reaching when every door seemed to close the moment I stood in front of it. That night, as I finally drifted to sleep, I had no idea that things were about to get even harder, or that the next call I received from Seattle would come not from Ethan, but from the clinic where Lily had delivered the baby. I woke early the next morning, long before the sun came up, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands. I stared at my phone, half expecting it to ring, half praying it would stay silent. I didn't know which outcome I feared more. When the call finally came, the sound cut through the quiet house so abruptly that my heart jumped. I hesitated for a second before answering. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. She said she was calling from the billing department at a clinic in Seattle and needed to verify payment information for services related to my daughter-in-law's postnatal care. I listened without speaking, gripping the edge of the table as she explained that part of the insurance coverage had been denied, and there was an outstanding balance of several $1,000s. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. Your number was listed as the responsible contact for payment. For a moment, I could not breathe. I asked her to repeat herself. She calmly explained it again, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. My name, my number, responsible for payment. I rubbed my temples slowly, trying to process the words. I asked her to tell me exactly what documents listed me. She said they had the form in front of them, signed by Ethan with my contact information filled in. A heat crawled up my neck. I could almost hear my pulse. I had been turned away from the hospital, shut out from seeing my grandson, treated like an unwelcome stranger. And now I was the one they expected to pay. The woman on the phone asked if I could confirm how I planned to take care of the balance. Her voice was polite, but unbending. I answered quietly that I would need to look into it and that I would call back. She thanked me and hung up. I set the phone down and stared at it. My hands trembled. I felt as if something inside me had cracked in a place I had tried so hard to protect. It took almost an hour before I gathered enough strength to call Ethan. When he answered, his voice sounded distracted, almost irritated. I asked him why my name and number were on the billing form. He hesitated, then spoke in a tired tone. "Mom, we had to put someone down. Insurance didn't cover everything. We are overwhelmed, and Lily is barely holding it together. I figured since you offered to help before, it made sense to list you." I closed my eyes and let the words settle, each one heavier than the last. I asked him when I had offered to pay. He said I had said something once about supporting them however I could. I told him that did not mean taking on debts I did not know about. He sighed loudly as if I were being unreasonable. "We are doing our best. I thought you would want to help." A numbness spread through my chest. I told him calmly that wanting to help did not mean becoming their financial safety net without my consent. He said he did not have time for a long discussion and that things were difficult right now. I told him I understood difficult. I had lived through more difficult moments than he could imagine. But being shut out from their lives and then asked to pay bills I had not agreed to was too much. He was quiet for a moment, then asked if I could just handle it this time. "Just this once," he said. I answered that I needed time to think. He ended the call quickly after that. I sat there in my quiet kitchen and let the silence swallow the conversation. The next few days were heavy. I could not focus on anything. I paced the house, picked up books I could not read, watched the light shift across the living room floor. I imagined Ethan and Lily in their home, holding their baby, going about their day without once thinking about how they had left me standing outside in the rain with a bag of soup. And now they expected me to fix their bills. Rosa noticed something was wrong the moment she walked into my house that week. She took one look at my face and wrapped her arms around me. I told her everything, the call, the bill, the way Ethan had spoken to me. She shook her head slowly. "That is not right. Elaine," she said it firmly, as if the truth of it filled the room. She reminded me that love and help are not the same as being taken advantage of. I knew she was right, but hearing the words out loud made something shift inside me. A small but steady resolve. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table again, with the phone in front of me. I picked it up and called the clinic. The same woman as before answered. I spoke slowly and clearly. I told her that I was not responsible for the bill. I told her I had not signed anything or agreed to payment. She asked if I was sure. I said I was. She said they would update their records and would need to contact Ethan directly. I thanked her and ended the call. When I set the phone down, I felt something inside me settle. It was not relief exactly, but something close to it, a boundary I had finally drawn. It did not take long before Ethan called. His voice was tight. He asked why I had told the clinic I was not responsible. I told him the truth, because I am not. He said their situation was fragile and I had made it worse. He said Lily was upset and felt abandoned. I listened without interrupting. When he was done, I told him calmly that I loved him and that I cared deeply about him and his family. but I would not be treated as a backup plan. I told him I would not be a wallet they reached for only when they needed something. He grew silent. I could hear him breathing on the other end. Then he said they were under pressure and did not need more complications. I answered that I understood pressure, but I also understood dignity. He said he had to go. That was it. No goodbye. I set the phone on the table and leaned back in my chair. The room was quiet again, that heavy kind of quiet that feels almost like a blanket. I closed my eyes and let the silence fill me. I told myself this was necessary, that sometimes doing the right thing does not feel good at all. The next morning when I woke, the air felt different. The light coming through the curtains was softer, and for the first time in days, I felt as if I could breathe fully again. I made coffee, sat down with my favorite mug, and stared at the steam rising. I did not know what would happen next with Ethan or Lily. I only knew that something inside me had shifted. The phone stayed quiet for the rest of the day. I moved through the house slowly, straightening things, dusting shelves, letting my mind wander. It was late in the afternoon when the phone finally rang again. I looked at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number, something from Seattle. I stood there for a moment before answering, not knowing if I was ready for whatever was coming next. I answered with a quiet hello, bracing myself without even knowing why. A woman's voice spoke on the line, steady but gentle. She introduced herself as a social worker from Harborview Medical Center in Seattle and asked if she was speaking to Elaine Porter. I told her yes, and the next words out of her mouth made my hand tighten around the phone. She said my daughter-in-law had been admitted 2 days earlier for what she described as a mental health crisis. I felt my whole body go still. She continued in that calm, professional voice, explaining that Lily was stable but overwhelmed and unable to care for her infant. She told me Ethan had been at the hospital around the clock and was becoming exhausted. She said they needed a temporary caregiver for the baby and that my name was listed as the secondary family contact. I leaned against the counter because my legs felt unsteady. All I could manage to say was, "Is Noah safe?" She told me he was in the pediatric observation unit for the moment, but would need to be released into family care by the following morning. She paused for a moment before asking if I was able to come. I swallowed hard. I asked what had happened. She explained that Lily had been showing signs of postpartum depression for months, and that the recent stress had brought everything to a breaking point. I felt something deep inside me twist, a mix of concern and sadness, not just for the baby, but for Lily too. Despite everything that had passed between us, I knew postpartum depression could pull someone under in ways that were invisible until it was too late. I told the social worker I would come. She gave me the address, the name of the pediatric nurse on duty, and instructions for picking up the necessary paperwork. When the call ended, I stood in my silent kitchen and stared at the wall for a long moment. Then I took a breath, grabbed my purse, and went to pack an overnight bag. I left Salem late that afternoon and drove north as the sun began to set behind the fir trees. The highway carried me past small towns and stretches of open land. At one point, I turned off the radio and let the hum of the car be the only sound. I tried to imagine what Ethan must have been going through, the fear and exhaustion, the helplessness of watching a partner struggle with something so heavy. For the first time in a long while, my anger softened just slightly. I reminded myself that life could break even the strongest people. It was full dark by the time I reached the parking garage at Harborview. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly as I walked toward the elevator with my bag slung over one shoulder. When the doors opened to the pediatric floor, The hall smelled like warm blankets and antiseptic. A nurse greeted me with a kind smile. She guided me to a small room with a bassinet near the window. My breath caught when I saw him. Noah was sleeping, his tiny chest rising with each soft breath. A pale blue blanket was tucked around him. I stepped closer and brushed my fingertips against the fabric. The nurse asked if I wanted a moment alone. I nodded. She slipped out quietly and closed the door behind her. I stood there for a long time watching him sleep. His face was softer than I remembered, his cheeks rounder. A tiny tremor of emotion shuddered through me. I whispered that Grandma was here now, and that everything was going to be all right. He stirred a little, opening his eyes just for a second, and I felt something break open inside me, something bright and warm despite everything that had happened. After a while, the nurse returned with papers to sign. She explained the temporary custody arrangement and told me that the hospital had already informed Ethan. She said he was still with Lily in the psychiatric wing and would likely call me soon. I thanked her and gathered the diaper bag they had prepared for me. When I stepped out into the hall with Noah in my arms, I felt the weight of something new settling into place. Responsibility. Yes, but also a strange sense of purpose I had not felt in years. I carried him gently, protecting his head with my hand, and made my way toward the elevators. As I stepped inside, my phone buzzed. It was Ethan. I answered quietly, trying not to let my voice shake. He sounded tired, older than he had sounded the last time we spoke, and there was no hint of anger in his tone now. He thanked me for coming. He apologized for everything, though the apology was so soft, I almost missed it. He told me Lily was sleeping and that the doctors were hopeful, but wanted to monitor her closely for a few days. I asked if he was all right. There was a long pause before he answered. He said he did not know. Then he said he was scared. That simple confession wrapped around my heart like a hand. I told him we would figure everything out, one step at a time. I could hear the sound of him breathing, unsteady and emotional. And for a moment, it was like listening to my little boy again, the one who used to cry in my arms after waking from nightmares. He asked if Noah was okay. I looked down at the baby nestled against my chest and said he was perfect. Ethan exhaled in relief. He said he would try to come by in the morning. I told him to rest and take care of himself. When the call ended, I glanced down at Noah again. He had drifted back to sleep. I carried him to the car and buckled him gently into the seat. His tiny fingers curled slightly, as if holding on to something only he could feel. I drove to a hotel near the hospital, the kind with simple rooms and warm lamps that made everything feel a little safer. Inside the room, I laid him in the portable crib the hospital had lent me. I sat beside him for a long time, watching him sleep. At one point, I reached for my phone and saw several missed calls from numbers I did not recognize, probably billing offices, insurance reps, or automated follow-ups. I turned the phone face down. Tonight was not for them. I lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Everything felt unreal, like I had stepped into a different life, a life where I held my grandson and my son needed me again, but in a way I had never imagined. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly, feeling a strange mixture of sorrow, fear, and something close to hope. I drifted to sleep without meaning to, and when I opened my eyes again, the room was darker. For a moment, I was unsure what had woken me, until I heard a small sound from the crib, a soft whimper, then another. I got up quickly and lifted Noah into my arms. He nestled close to my chest, warm and fragile. As I rocked him gently in the quiet room, a single thought rose above all the others. My life had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. I held Noah close, until his small body relaxed again, his breathing settling into a soft rhythm against my shoulder. For a moment, I just stood there, swaying gently, letting the quiet fill the room. When I finally laid him back in the crib, he stirred but did not wake. I pulled the thin blanket up to his chest and watched him for a long moment before I stepped back. I could not fall asleep again. My mind was too full, my nerves too tight. I sat in the small chair by the window and watched the lights of the city flicker against the clouds. Somewhere out there, Ethan was sleeping on a hospital cot or pacing a hallway. Somewhere out there, Lily was lying in a room surrounded by people who were trying to keep her safe. And here I was with their baby, the same baby I had been told to stay away from. By morning, a pale gray light had spread across the room. Noah woke with a soft cry, and I lifted him quickly, warming the bottle the hospital had sent along. He drank slowly, his eyes half closed, his hand resting on mine. There was something steadying about caring for him, something grounding. I felt purpose in each small motion, something I had not felt in a long while. After feeding him, I washed up quickly and packed his things. I wanted to be at the hospital early, partly to see the social worker again, and partly because I hoped Ethan would come before visiting hours became crowded. I strapped Noah into the car seat and drove to Harborview. The psychiatric wing had the kind of silence that made every sound echo softly. A nurse at the desk guided me to the family waiting room and told me a doctor would speak with me soon. I sat on the small couch with Noah in my arms, bouncing him gently on my knee, and stared at the frosted glass door across the hall. Behind that door was Lily. I wondered if she was sleeping or crying or sitting alone thinking about everything that had unraveled. Ethan arrived about half an hour later. He looked thinner, worn out in a way I had never seen. His eyes were red, and his shoulders slumped like someone carrying too much weight. When he saw me holding Noah, he stopped in the doorway as if he did not know how to step forward. I asked how he was. He said he was tired. I asked how Lily was. He said she was overwhelmed, confused, ashamed. He rubbed his face with both hands and sat down beside me. He kept looking at Noah with an expression I could not quite read, part relief, part guilt. He reached out and touched his son's cheek lightly. I told him he was doing the best he could, but he shook his head. He said things had been falling apart for months, that Lily had been withdrawing, blaming herself for every little thing, panicking when Noah cried, barely eating or sleeping. He said he had tried to hide it from me because he did not want to worry me. Then he admitted the truth. He did not want to hear me tell him something was wrong because he already knew it. A doctor came in then and spoke with both of us. She said Lily needed time and consistent treatment. She said postpartum depression could turn into something deeper if left unchecked. She said Lily would stay in the hospital for several more days, maybe longer, depending on her progress. She also said Ethan needed support because he had been carrying everything alone. When she left, the room felt heavier. Ethan put his face in his hands and sat very still. I could see a tremor in his shoulders. I rested my hand gently on his back. He leaned toward me. Not quite a hug, but something close. He whispered that he was sorry for everything he had said to me these past months. He said he knew he had pushed me away. He said he had been scared of everything changing and did not know how to ask for help without feeling like he was failing. I felt a knot in my throat, but I kept my voice steady. I told him I understood fear. I told him I had felt it too, watching my only child slip away from me. Noah stirred, and I adjusted him in my arms. Ethan watched him for a long moment before asking if he could hold him. I nodded and placed the baby gently in his arms. The way he held Noah this time was different, slower, more tender. His fingers shook slightly as he traced the baby's cheek. He said he needed time to figure out what came next, that he wanted to take responsibility but felt lost. I told him that taking responsibility did not mean doing everything alone. It meant knowing when to accept help from the people who loved him. He looked at me then, really looked, and there was something in his eyes I had not seen in a long time, a kind of recognition. After a while, he said he needed to meet with Lily's care team again, but asked if I could stay nearby. I told him of course. When he left the room, I held Noah close again. His tiny fingers curled into the fabric of my shirt, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a reminder that love can survive distance, silence, and hurt. It may bend, but it does not break easily. Later in the afternoon, a social worker met with me privately. She asked if I was willing to care for Noah for a few days, maybe longer. I said yes without hesitation. She explained the temporary guardianship paperwork, and I signed where she pointed. She asked if I had support back home. I told her about Rosa. She nodded approvingly. After finishing the forms, I walked outside to the courtyard with Noah bundled in a soft blanket. The sky had cleared, and sunlight touched the tops of the trees. A few patients from different wings were walking around with nurses guiding them gently. The air felt fresh, cool, carrying the scent of pine. I sat on a bench and held Noah against my chest. I whispered small things to him. How brave he was, how loved he was, how none of this was his fault. I told him that life was complicated, that grown-ups made mistakes, but sometimes broken things could be put back together in new ways. As I sat there, my mind drifted to all the memories I had been trying not to revisit. Holidays where Ethan had barely called. Birthdays where my gift had been acknowledged with a text. Moments where my presence seemed to push them further away rather than bring them closer. I felt the weight of every rejection, but also something else. A strange calm, a steadying certainty that the time for pleading was over, the time for clarity had arrived. I kissed Noah's forehead and stood up. The sun felt warm on my face. I knew things would not get better overnight. I knew wounds could not heal quickly, but I also knew that life had just handed me a moment of unexpected responsibility and perhaps a chance to rebuild something I thought I had lost forever. As I headed back into the hospital, Noah nestled against me. I felt a shift inside me, subtle but unmistakable, a beginning of something new. And it would not be long before that shift was put to the test. Ethan stepped out of the elevator just as I was walking back inside with Noah in my arms. He looked like he had aged 5 years in the span of a few days. His shoulders slumped, his jaw tight with exhaustion. When he saw us, he paused and pressed his hand against the wall as if steadying himself. For a moment I thought he might collapse. He walked toward us slowly. His eyes stayed on his son, then lifted to mine. He said he had just met with Lily's psychiatrist. They wanted her to stay several more days, maybe a week. He rubbed the back of his neck and said Lily was more fragile than he realized, that she cried every time she woke and asked if the baby was safe. I told him Noah was doing just fine. I said he slept, ate, and fussed exactly like any healthy infant. Ethan nodded, but he still looked shaken. He asked if he could hold him. I placed Noah in his arms and stepped back a little to give him space. Ethan held his son with the same gentle care he used to show as a teenager, when he found an injured bird in the yard, or when he carried home the stray cat he insisted we keep. His eyes softened, while Noah blinked sleepily up at him. Then he said quietly that he had been scared he would not see his son for days because he could not take him inside the psychiatric wing. He sat down on a bench in the hallway, and I sat beside him. For a while, neither of us spoke. There were footsteps from nurses, voices echoing from distant rooms, the hum of machines behind the walls. Noah made a soft gurgling sound and reached up with his tiny hand. Ethan smiled faintly, like the expression surprised even him. He finally said he had been thinking a lot about the last few months. He said he knew he had put distance between us. He said he knew I had felt rejected, and he was sorry for all of it. I listened quietly, feeling his words like small waves hitting the shore. I wanted to tell him everything I had felt, but I knew this was not the moment for heavy truths. He said Lily had been pushing him to limit outside contact for months, afraid of judgment, afraid her parents would blame her for not handling motherhood better than they thought she should. He said he let that fear shape every decision. I nodded and rested my hand lightly on his arm. He said he did not expect forgiveness, at least not quickly, but hoped we could fix what had broken. Noah squirmed, and Ethan adjusted him gently. I told him that healing something does not mean pretending it was never broken. He nodded slowly and stared at his son again. After a while, he said he needed to go see Lily again, and that he would meet me later at the cafeteria. I told him to take his time. When he left, I walked toward the large window near the end of the hallway and rocked Noah in my arms. He had fallen asleep halfway through Ethan's apology and looked peaceful, unaware of the storm the adults around him were trying to navigate. Later, in the cafeteria, I found a corner table away from the noise. I ordered a bowl of soup and a cup of tea. When Ethan arrived, he skipped the food line and sat down across from me with his hands clasped tightly together. He said things were worse with Lily's parents than he had admitted. He said they had been arguing for months, blaming him for Lily's exhaustion and accusing him of not providing enough stability. He said they had offered to take Noah permanently until Lily recovered. When he told me that, the spoon in my hand froze halfway to my mouth. I asked what he said to them. He said he told them no, that Lily needed treatment, not shame, and that he was still Noah's father. Then he said he felt cornered, like everyone expected him to choose a side even when he was drowning. I asked if they knew I was here. He said he had not told them yet. He said they would not approve, and he wanted to avoid another fight. I told him sometimes the right thing does not come with approval. He sighed and rubbed his eyes again. Before we finished talking, his phone buzzed. He looked at it and said he needed to step out to speak with one of Lily's doctors. I told him I would take Noah back to the hotel for the evening. He nodded and squeezed my hand lightly before leaving. In the hotel room that night, I fed Noah, changed him, and held him until he fell asleep against my shoulder. His breath was warm and steady. His small fingers curled into the fabric of my shirt. I felt something swelling inside me, something I had not felt in years, a sense of being needed, not out of obligation, but because love itself demanded it. When he finally drifted off, I laid him gently in the crib again, then sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet settle over me. I thought about the last year, about the rejection, the distance, the words that had stung more than I admitted. I thought about how it had all led to this moment in a small hotel room in Seattle, with a baby who had no idea how much he had changed everything. My phone buzzed. I reached for it cautiously. It was a text from Ethan. He said he wanted to update me in the morning. Then he wrote something that made my eyes sting. He said he was grateful I came. He said he did not know what he would have done if I had not answered the call. I set the phone aside and lay back on the bed. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about how love can bend without breaking, how people can lose their way and still find a path back. I closed my eyes and let the room grow dark and quiet around me. Somewhere between consciousness and sleep, I felt a shift inside me again, subtle but unmistakable, like something that had been locked for years was beginning to open. And it would not be long before all of us were forced to confront the truth about what had brought us here. Something inside me felt unlatched, just slightly, like a locked window catching its first breeze in years. I stared at the dim hotel ceiling, listening to the soft rise and fall of Noah's breath, and let that feeling settle. It stayed with me through the night, into the quiet of morning, and all the way back to the hospital when I met Ethan for another long day of updates and decisions none of us had ever imagined making. He looked steadier that morning, standing in the hallway with a coffee he probably didn't taste. There was a faint curve at the corner of his mouth when he saw me arrive with Noah strapped against my chest. He reached out, touched the baby's back, then let his hand drop as if afraid he might break the moment if he held it too long. He told me the doctors believed Lily was improving, slowly but clearly. She had slept most of the night. She had asked for him when she woke. She had even asked for Noah, though the doctors said it was still too soon for direct contact. I felt a wave of relief pass through me at that. Beneath everything that had happened, she was still reaching for her child. We sat together on a small bench in the hallway and talked quietly. There was no hostility now, no careful distance, just two people trying to hold steady while life rearranged itself around them. He told me he had finally spoken to Lily's parents. He said the conversation had not gone well. They blamed him for everything, said he should have seen it sooner, insisted they knew what was best for Lily and the baby. He said they wanted Noah out of the hospital and under their care permanently. I asked what he said to them. He said he told them no. He said he told them Lily was getting the help she needed and that Noah was safe with me. He said they did not take it well, especially when he told them he had put my name on the temporary guardianship forms. He said his mother-in-law had cried, and his father-in-law had called him irresponsible. Then he turned to me and said he was sorry for letting their opinions shape so much of how he treated me. He said he had spent so much time trying to keep the peace that he stopped seeing who was actually standing in front of him. I felt tears welling in my eyes, but I blinked them back. There would be time for tears later. A nurse approached and asked if we wanted to meet with Lily's care team. Ethan nodded, and I said I would wait with Noah down the hall. For a moment he hesitated, looking between us. Then he asked if I would come. He said he wanted me there. He said he needed me there. Inside the small conference room, a team of doctors and therapists sat with clipboards and warm voices. They explained Lily's condition carefully. They said she had been struggling long before she gave birth. They said her symptoms had been masked by her determination to be perfect for her family. They said perfection had turned into pressure, then into fear, then into exhaustion. They recommended outpatient therapy after her release and monitored visits with Noah until she felt stable again. They also suggested Ethan seek counseling to manage his own stress. He agreed without hesitation. When the physicians finished speaking, Lily's therapist asked if we had any questions. Ethan asked when she might be able to see Noah again. The therapist said soon, but not yet. She said Lily needed to rebuild her sense of safety and confidence first. She said Noah's well-being depended on Lily learning how to breathe again without guilt suffocating her. After the meeting, we visited the observation room where Lily was resting. She was awake, sitting in a chair by the window with a soft blanket over her lap. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and her eyes looked clearer than the last time I had seen her. She smiled faintly when Ethan walked in, a tired but real smile. She reached for his hand and held it. Then she looked at me. Her voice was quiet and thin, but not cold. She said, "Thank you." Just those 2 words. But they carried more weight than any long apology could have. I nodded and told her she was safe and that Noah was doing well. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry. She whispered that she missed him. I told her she would see him soon. We stayed for a few more minutes, then stepped out to let her rest. Outside in the hallway, Ethan exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding that breath for days. He looked at me and said he wanted to go home for a while, to sleep and shower and think. He asked if he could come by my hotel room later to see Noah again. I told him, of course. Back at the hotel, Noah napped peacefully while I cleaned up bottles and folded the small clothes the hospital had given me. When Ethan knocked on the door, I opened it to see him carrying takeout containers and looking more rested than before. He sat on the small couch, holding Noah while I ate. Then I held Noah while he ate. It felt like a rhythm we had once mastered and were learning again. He told me he was planning to take family leave from work. He said he wanted to be present, not just physically, but emotionally. He said he did not want Lily to feel alone for another minute. I told him that was the right decision. He nodded and asked if I would help him through all of this. I told him I would, but only if he respected my boundaries. He said he understood and promised to try. When he left that night, he hugged me quietly, warm, grateful, real. The next week moved slowly, each day a careful step forward. Noah stayed with me while Ethan visited Lily daily. Her progress continued steadily, and by the end of the week, she was ready to see the baby. Ethan called me that morning, his voice trembling with emotion. He asked if I would bring Noah to the hospital courtyard where Lily could visit under supervision. I agreed and drove over with Noah wrapped snugly in a soft blue blanket. Lily stood with a therapist nearby. She looked nervous, then relieved, then overwhelmed all at once when she saw her son. Her hands shook as she reached for him. I placed Noah gently in her arms. She held him like he was a fragile miracle, her breath catching as she whispered his name again and again. For a few moments, the 3 of us stood there in a quiet circle. There was no bitterness in the air, no accusation, no apology demanded, only 3 people doing their best to rebuild a family that had cracked but not shattered. A month later, Lily was released with a full treatment plan in place. Ethan moved temporarily into her parents' home to help them all find stability again. They invited me to visit often. It was awkward at first, but once Lily's parents understood how much I meant to Noah, the tension eased. I kept my boundaries but stayed open, letting trust grow slowly and honestly. Over the next year, everything changed gently. Lily continued therapy and grew steadier. Ethan became more patient and grounded. I spent weekends with them, reading to Noah, walking him around the neighborhood, watching him grow into a curious, joyful little boy who had no memory of the pain that once surrounded his birth. One summer afternoon, when Noah was almost 2, he ran into my arms at the park and called me Grandma Elaine for the first time without prompting. Ethan smiled from the picnic table, Lily beside him, and in that moment I knew we had found something new, something sturdier than the broken pieces we started with. A life where love was not demanded or withheld, but chosen. If you felt something in this journey, if parts of it reminded you of your own family or your own strength, I would love to hear your thoughts. Your stories remind us that none of us walk these paths alone. And if you want to stay with me for more stories about resilience, forgiveness, and finding your voice again, I hope you will stay close and join me for the next chapter when it comes.